Water control is so important in watercolor that I've decided to create a whole video about how to control water. What is the right ratio between water and pigment to achieve different effects? In this video, I'm going to explain you everything I know about it, and you can apply everything you will learn on your own watercolor paintings, flowers or landscapes. My name is Luisa and this is the Lulu Blue Studio. Let's start. I will use for this video a round brush, and I will use my jar of water to show you the ways that your brush can handle water, and my color palette. I will just use mainly one color, the red color, to show you. The first thing that we always do is to wet our brush into the cup of water. One very important thing to do is always to remove the excessive amount of water that probably you can notice in this moment on my brush by touching the brush on the jar and removing the excessive amount of water into the jar. And with this wet brush, we usually start to take some pigment on our color palette. The very first thing you need to do is always to wet any pigment you are going to work with in watercolor. In this case, I will use mainly a red pigment. And I will show you now different ratios of water pigment we can obtain in watercolor in a right way. So where the amount of water is fine, we are able to control water, and we can obtain different effects. The very first swatch we are going to create is a swatch with a high concentration of pigment. As you can see, I keep taking pigment and with a little concentration of water. So as you can see here, there is a little bit of a puddle of water, but not too much. And with this high concentration of pigment on my brush, I start to run onto the page and I let my brush go. So in this example, I have a high concentration of pigment and a not so high concentration of water. The surface is still wet, but is not super wet, let's say, and I see there is a sort of sheen onto this swatch that I've created. And let's say that if I consider this ratio of water to pigment, I have a little amount of water, let's just say plus, and I have a high amount of pigment. So this is the situation in which we are in. This is a correct ratio of pigment to water we can use in floral painting. For example, I can create my first petals with flowers very concentrated, and then I can create other petals less concentrated. So I can use, for example, this type of ratio to create, for example, floral compositions. I can remove part of the pigment in the cup of water, and I can use, therefore, less pigment on my brush and more water. So I've removed part of the pigment here. I'm removing the excessive amount of water on this brush, but this brush now contains more water and less pigment. And with this ratio, I can create another swatch. As I'm creating this swatch, I have the feeling, I can feel it on my brush, that this swatch runs through the paper a little bit easier than this one because there is more water. And if I consider the ratio between water and pigment, I have a little bit more water and I have less pigment. I can remove part of the pigment in the cup of water, and I can remove the excessive of pigment on my jar, and I can use this ratio to create another swatch. So I have more water and less pigment here. compared to this swatch and compared to this swatch. All of these three swatches are swatches where the ratio between pigment and water is fine to be used for any composition in watercolor, landscape or flower composition, for example. And playing with different ratios of pigment and water, I can obtain different things. For example, if I remove further pigment into the cup of water and I remove the excessive amount of water on my jar, I can create another swatch where clearly I have more water than pigment, where the brush really runs easily onto the page, where I have an amount of water that is higher and an amount of pigment that is lower. And I can still use, for example, in watercolor painting, this ratio to create, for example, if it was in blue color, a sky, or it could be sea and seawater. Therefore, I try to explain how with different ratios you can obtain different effects that are all fine. And all of these ratios have in common that there is never a puddle of water on these swatches. Water is always on an amount that after a while dries, and there are no hard lines and there are no amounts where the water stays just on the page. For example, I want to show you an example where there is going to be an amount of water too high on the surface of the page. So for example, I'm creating just a circle in red color, and for example, I haven't removed the whole drop of water and I keep adding brush strokes on the page, and as you can see, there is some water that is moving within the circle of this page, and this is just too much water to use in watercolor painting. So this is what we don't want to achieve in watercolor painting. In order to improve a situation like this one, we can use the same brush, dry the brush on a paper cloth, and just use the brush to remove the excess of water on this circle. And if there is still a sort of puddle, we can remove the puddle by touching the paper and removing the excessive amount of water. And this is a consistency at the moment where I can enjoy watercolor painting again, because I will not have hard lines or I will not have effects at the end that I will not like. So if you find yourself in a situation in which the amount of water on your page is just too high, remember that you can save the situation either using the same brush and just removing the excessive amount of water on your brush on your tablecloth, and then you can remove the excess of water from your page. Or for example, you can use a dry brush, a different brush altogether, or a piece of paper that you're not using, and you can just remove the excessive amount of water from your page. Now I want to show you, for example, effects you can obtain playing with different ratios of pigment and water, always controlling your water but obtaining different effects. This is going to be an abstract example. For example, I will take some blue pigment and I am getting this pigment ready to be used, so I use some water and I use a ratio of pigment and water where I wanted to have more water than pigment. I wanted to have a watery consistency. So I remove part of the pigment in the cup of water and I remove the excess of pigment on my jar. I'm gonna start to create this very light swatch of pigment. It's a light blue, and for example this can be, let's pretend it's a piece of sky. I've used an amount of water and pigment that allows me to have a nice consistency. There are no puddles of water anywhere. I will let this dry and I will use then a different consistency of pigment onto my brush to create something, for example, on top of this swatch in a few minutes. An example that I want to show you is to see how you can play with different consistencies and different ratios of pigment and water on your brush. So you can take any brush you have and any color on your color palette, and you can start to create, for example, either swatches like we did in the first part of this video, or even, for example, just some lines where you can see here the amount of water is limited compared to the amount of pigment. So I have a lot of pigment on the tip of this brush and I'm creating these lines. And then I can play and I can take my cup of water, I can remove part of the pigment into the water, I can remove the excessive amount of water from my brush, but still having a higher amount of water compared to the pigment, I can play and see what are other consistencies that I can obtain with my brush, and for example, what are other strokes I can create. In all of these examples, there is a correct control of water, and I am managing, I'm deciding what is happening in this situation, and I control how much water and pigment I'm using. There are no puddles and there are no hard lines. So I encourage you to make some of these tests, let's say, where you can play with any brush you have, take any color you have on your color palette and just practice these brush strokes to have a feeling of what you have on your brush and how it behaves onto the paper. I can assure you that the more you're going to paint with watercolors, the more you're going to have the feeling of what is right to have on your brush in order to be able to control the water. For sure, this is not a science, and for sure sometimes you might incur in situations in which you're going to have much more water on your page than you expected. So remember that you can use a brush like this one and you can remove part of the excessive water onto the surface of your page, or you can use another brush, a dry brush or a tablecloth. And my first tip for you is to always remember when you are dipping your brush into the cup of water to remember to remove the excessive amount of water on the jar by pressing your brush and removing the drop that is going to come off. You can also, for example, remove the excessive amount of water exactly onto the paper that you have in front of you. For example, if you have your brush is wet, you take some red, for example, from your color palette, but then you notice there is too much water compared to what you want to have on the page. You can remove the excessive by doing so and then adding brush strokes to your page. And having different ratios of water and pigment will allow you to obtain different effects. And you can play with these different effects in watercolor to obtain completely different compositions. For example, in this case, the very first layer of sky has been laid onto paper with a very little amount of pigment and a very high amount of water, in the same way as we did for this swatch. Now, for example, I can take for example, a round brush in smaller size, and I can instead play taking a higher amount of pigment and just a little amount of water that is just sitting onto my brush. And with this very concentrated amount of pigment, and we are in this situation, for example, we can create some, for example, lines or birds. You can, obtain effects that you want onto your page. So what I'm trying to say is that playing with different consistencies of pigment and ratios of water and pigment on the same area, you can have different effects. In this case, we are playing with the wet on dry technique, but we are also playing with a very high concentration of pigment and very little concentration of water with this small brush, and we have played with a different situation with a different ratio, very high concentration of water and very little concentration of pigment to create the background of this swatch. So I hope with this video I was able to answer some of your questions regarding water control and how to improve brush strokes and compositions, and I was able to give you a clarification on how to understand first what to achieve with which ratios of water and pigment, but also how to achieve the best results that you can have on your flower compositions or landscapes or anything you want to paint in watercolor. Remember that this is not a scientific process, so the more you're going to paint, the more you're going to understand what is the ratio that you want to have, the more you're going to achieve in an easier way the effects on the paper. I encourage you to make some tests, some swatches like we did, some brush strokes of this type to have a feeling, and I encourage you to keep in mind that this is still a fun process, and with more practice you will improve all of this. I really hope this tutorial was useful for you. If so, let me know also in the comments below, and I hope to see you in the next video.